Hello, and welcome to episode number 55 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. In last week's episode, we kicked off a discussion of a certain kind of alien interaction, the kind well attested to in the UFO phenomenon literature, where human beings are repeatedly interacted with by non-human intelligences, and often from a very young age. As time goes on, that interaction often includes abduction, that is, the taking of these people from their homes up onto what appear to be spacecraft, either orbiting the Earth in cloaked fashion or existing in some kind of hyperspace or alternate realm of reality where time and space seem to function differently. That level of ontological shock that arises for these abductees/contactees, as we've said numerous times over the course of this podcast, cannot be overstated. These encounters shake these people to the core. And that's true whether they ultimately come to see the experiences as positive, negative, or neutral. These meetings, whether you see them as intergalactic or interdimensional in nature, or some combination of the two, seem to very often include a biological element. That is to say, the people who are taken on board these craft remember having had various medical experiments and procedures done to them, including the collecting of reproductive material that seems to be part of a vast hybridization program of some kind. Furthering this narrative all the more, many of these experiencers also report having had contact with some of these very hybrid beings, including ones they are told and believed to be their very offspring. The case of Terry Lovelace fits all of the above criteria to a T. This case is fascinating for several different reasons. First, because it is told by a person who has had a distinguished professional career and who seems to be credible in every measure one can reasonably apply. Secondly, because Terry Lovelace's retelling of his experiences, extending over an entire lifetime, are so rich in vivid detail. And thirdly, because, as I already mentioned, this case is so typical of many such cases cataloged within the UFO phenomenon literature. In last week's episode of Point of Convergence, we discussed two key sequences of Lovelace's lifelong encounters. A window of time from his childhood when he encountered gray aliens he, at the time, called the Monkey Men, and then a climactic event that occurred while he was a young man in the military, where he and a close friend encountered a massive black triangle UFO craft while camping in a remote area. This latter experience resulted in an abduction of both men and a subsequent interrogation by the Air Force upon their hasty return from that excursion. This week we'll pick up right where we left off, discussing the nature of that interrogation and what that suggested the military already knew about this phenomenon, as well as details about Lovelace's experience while on board the triangular craft, and then moving forward to events from later in his life after his time in the military, in this, the 55th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, just to note that this is part 2 of a 2-part series we're doing on the experiences of Terry Lovelace. So if you have not heard the first part of this series, I would go back and listen to that first episode 54 and then come back and check out this episode 55. Now, Terry Lovelace's experiences are documented in his book, Incident at Devil's Den, a true story by Terry Lovelace. He's also written a second book titled Devil's Den: The Reckoning, which covers additional experiences as well as additional recollections he had later on, as well as a section that includes letters he received from other people who've had similarly bizarre incidents in their life. Now, last week we left off after Terry and his friend Toby had returned from this camping trip that turned into an abduction experience. And not just an abduction experience by chance. Rather, both of these men had concluded that this seems to have been a setup, that their entire decision to go to a remote location like Devil's Den, and even from within that, a very remote location from within that camping ground, was actually a suggestion implanted by these others, by these alien beings. And just to be even more clear about that, they were directed to go to a specific meadow, which is cleared. And in some ways, you could argue it's the perfect size for a landing spot for that massive triangular UFO they later encounter. In fact, one of the people that interviewed Terry Lovelace on a podcast was able to, with Google Maps, Google Earth, was able to locate this particular meadow. And even today, it is cleared, which is very interesting. In fact, Terry Lovelace wonders aloud if there's something to that. Perhaps there's some agreement going on and that this is a known location where this large triangular craft lands. Whatever the case, that location is still there. You can find it on Google Earth and it's still cleared. And you can see the size of the craft, because remember, in his account, he talks about the triangular craft pretty much taking up the entire meadow. So by looking at that location at Devil's Den State Park, you get a sense of the size of the craft they encountered. Now, once they left that area and went back home, they left early, if you remember, because they were quite distraught and confused after their experience, their abduction experience. They went back home, and then because they were in rough shape, they were taken to the hospital, the military hospital, by both of their wives. And then after an interview that was part of that examination at the hospital, certain things must have been said by both men that even though they were trying to keep under wraps what actually happened, they never mentioned abduction or UFO, they said enough to trip certain flags that got the attention of the upper echelons of the military establishment, which resulted in 2 agents showing up to interrogate both these men. Now, as these things often work, the 2 men were separated, so they don't know what each of them said. Terry recounts his particular interrogation experience. And then even more shockingly, he is quickly given a bunch of papers that he's asked to sign. Again, he's still in very rough shape. He's still very confused. And yet they basically, under duress, force him to sign these papers. One of them is an NDA, saying he will never share these experiences. So that's interesting in itself, because by coming out, by writing this book and sharing these experiences, Terry is actually breaking that NDA, and he admits that's what he's doing. But at this point in his retirement age, he doesn't care. He feels like it's important that he comes forward for the sake of other experiencers, and so that the general public will understand what's been going on, and perhaps what the military already knows about it. Now, in addition to signing an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, he also kind of unknowingly, because these papers were just shuffled in front of him one after another and he signed away, he also agreed to have a hypnosis session done. And when he actually later questioned the agents and wondered why he was being hypnotized, they said, well, you signed right here saying you were willing to do this in addition to us searching your house and your vehicle, etc. Do you want to renege on those agreements that you signed? And at that point, Terry isn't sure what to do. But this agent says, if you want to renege, you can. That's within your rights. And then I'll see you at your court-martial. So clearly he is bluffing there. But a young Terry, again, he was a young man in his early 20s at this point, feels the pressure. He doesn't want to be in trouble. He certainly doesn't want to be court-martialed. So he agrees to this hypnosis session. Now, this is very interesting because everything that's happened up until now, the response of the military suggests to Terry in reflection, and I have to agree with him, that there seems to be some degree of knowledge by the military. Something about this experience tripped certain flags that they were looking out for, that it seems like they were aware of these abduction experiences, that they can happen, that they do happen, and that they interrogate military personnel when they do happen. And speaking of that, the knowledge of the military seems to go beyond that. And some of that becomes clear in the midst of this interrogation, which included this hypnotic regression session that Terry was subjected to. And I now want to jump to that part of the book where the interrogation is described. So in this next section I quote from, just remember that at this point, Terry has been put under hypnotic regression, although he has resisted it and he believes that he is not fully under, despite this agent thinking that he's under. Now, this person conducting this interrogation, this hypnotic regression, was actually a major in the Air Force. But he asks Terry to call him Brad. Again, that's a method used to make Terry relax. And then this is what happened next during that hypnotic regression. Quote, Brad asked, you and Tobias saw the stars first, then the triangle, and what did you see next? We watched the ship come in from just 3 little lights. It climbed up and over us. God, it was so big. But we weren't afraid. Toby wasn't scared either. We just went to sleep. We were so tired and we just weren't interested. I was reliving the whole thing in my mind, and it was terrifying. I could hear the major addressing the 2 agents. I've seen this dozens of times before, he said. There is alien apathy and alien amnesia. They're 2 separate phenomena. It's common, unquote. So I mentioned this in passing last week. It's very interesting here. While this hypnotic regression session is being conducted and all 3 men present believe that Terry is actually under and won't remember any of this part, the major is turning and addressing these 2 other agents, the agents that were first on the scene, to interrogate Terry. And he says that this alien apathy and alien amnesia, these are the terms he used, are common. Now let's jump back into the book. Quoting again from the book, quote, the major resumed the interrogation. You weren't interested and you went to bed. What time did you enter your tent that night? Right before their ship docked, I said. It landed in the field about midnight, but it was never on the ground. It stayed about 30 feet over the meadow floor. Brad, it just hung there, I said as I watched it all play out in my head. I was amazed at the images I saw, but they were familiar too. It was like seeing an old friend you'd not seen in years. Brad said, Terry, tell me about the spaceship in the meadow. What did it look like? What did you see? I said, a giant triangle of a spaceship. It was hundreds of feet across. It was huge. It was so incredible. I can see it now. It was as fresh in my mind as what I had had for breakfast. It was right there. I paused. I saw it all again and wanted to imprint it in my memory forever. I said, it was right there and it was so big. It filled the meadow like a 5-story building. Good, Terry. That must have been exciting for you. Tell me about the ship. When they took you and you were inside with Toby, what did you see inside? Incredible things, I said. This had to be one of their bigger ones, I added, almost as a matter of fact. My conscious mind stopped playing the music. It dawned on me. He knows all about them already. He is spot on with everything. It was no star. The son of a bitch knew it was no star. It was a goddamn spaceship. How did he know? How could he know? He's leading me down a path to find out how much I know. Go on, Terry. You're doing well now. What did you see? I said, it was a big ship, Brad, a large one. It was different than the flying saucers and the giant ship I saw before. It wasn't silver and it wasn't shiny. It was a matte finish. I'd call it very dark gray or black, kind of like the black diamond we saw over Kilo 5. By the way, that's another sighting he had had earlier on. Finishing off the quote, it had lights on each corner that ran from the bottom to the top, unquote. Now we're going to jump to the section of the hypnotic regression where Terry describes the beings he saw inside this massive triangular craft. And this part's very interesting because he encounters what looked to be not just humanoid, but human beings that even seem to be in some kind of military regalia. Quoting from the book again, quote, Brad's voice startled me. Go on, Terry, and tell me what you see. Disturbed by the unaccountable period, I began again. It was black and 5 stories tall. It was enormous. There were 3 saucers situated inside like planes on a carrier parked below deck. There was a crowd of people, too. We're all waiting for our turn on the table. The space people control us. The taller aliens are milling about. They are the ones who control everything. If one of them looks at you, it's like being naked. They can see and know everything in your mind. That was the scariest thing, so I avoided looking at them. How many humans did you see? Brad asked. 50 or 60? A lot of people. Some of the human beings were crew members. They ignored us. Tell me, Terry, tell me what the human crew members wore. I said, tan-colored flight suits with orange insignias of rank on their shoulders, I said. That created a stir. I heard Gregory say, son of a bitch. And then he said, quote, Terry, you'll forget about the men in tan flight suits. Tell me, where did they take you next? Gregory wanted to know. In retrospect, I think he wanted to shift my focus away from the men dressed in tan. Terry, turn your head now and look. Terry, tell me about the aquariums, unquote. Now, just jumping a little bit further forward, Terry comes across these aquariums when he's being led down this part of the ship towards some sort of medical procedure that's going to be done. And he notices these aquariums off to his side. And Brad keys in on this. He says, quote, Terry, turn your head now and look. Terry, tell me about the aquariums. What do you see? Terry responds, they are big fish tanks. Inside them, I thought they were puppies at first, reptilian lizard-like things floating in pink water. They were ugly with big eyes. One twitched. I must have screamed. Brad forced me to look. Terry, they're images from the past and they can't hurt you now. How many aquariums do you see? 100 or more aquariums, I said. They cover a whole wall. There is pink water inside and some are bigger. They look like, no, hell no. These are human beings? How can this be? These can't be living human beings. They are different. Oh God, they are not like us. One moved again, its head turned towards us, and its eye blinked, unquote. So before we move on to this section where an examination then happens, let's first reflect on what we just read. To be crystal clear here, what seems to be implied by Terry is that when he recognizes human beings in what seem to be military regalia of some sort or another, he believes the reactions of these three men, these three agents, the major and the two other agents, suggest to him that they know about these kinds of human beings and that they're disturbed that actually an abductee like Terry actually remembers. So they're not surprised that human beings were on board, but rather that Terry can actually remember it. And then they try to give him a hypnotic suggestion so that he will not remember that specific part of the encounter. Very curious. I'm sure you'll agree. All right, so now let's jump ahead to when the examination is about to start. Quoting from the book again, quote, what's about to start, Terry? The examination, I say. They do medical things and hurt me while I'm on the table. I fill my lungs with air to scream and nothing comes out. Oh God, help me please. There's a tall one there. Don't look at me. Oh God, he's going to look at me. Sensing my anxiety, Brad squeezed my hand and said softly, relax now, Terry, and tell me about the tall one. He can't hurt you now. Tell me about him. He's not benign or malevolent. If he could talk, he'd say, nothing personal, just doing my job, man. He's a different type of entity, a different animal entirely. He's insect-like and as tall as the aliens. The gray ones are their drones to do his bidding and help him. They are worker bees. What does the insect thing want with you? Brad asked. I think they are trying to learn our anatomy, learn how we work. They show no empathy whatsoever and just go about their business. They hurt me with instruments and mechanical stainless steel probes and knives. There are tools that hang from a low dome ceiling. Everything is white porcelain and stainless steel. I'm restrained, and they did medical things to me. I tried to tell them I wasn't anesthetized. I was less than a human being. I was their lab rat. Then they make me forget, and everything will be okay, unquote. Now, speaking of this examination, I'd like to jump forward to a section where this tall insectoid-like being who's conducting the medical examination seems to grow frustrated that Terry is making so much noise, putting up such a fuss. And this again touches on what I talked about last week in terms of the misapprehension of human psychology by these others. They seem to not understand how we work. They still seem to make faulty assumptions about how to handle us. Quoting from that section of the book, quote, I heard his voice inside my head. I heard it as clearly as any spoken word. He told me I had to stop screaming. He said, you know us. We will not harm you. You will go back and you will not remember. So why do you scream? He touched my right temple again and I immediately lost consciousness until they took me back, unquote. Now, again, this is fascinating, and this again speaks to the misunderstanding, the misapprehension of our psychology. This being assumes that since Brad knows he will be taken back, he won't ultimately be harmed, that there's no logical reason for him to scream. But of course, Terry is screaming because the moment is painful. What they're doing in that present moment is painful. Again, this seems to speak to a disconnect in terms of the way we communicate with them and vice versa. Now, just as a quick reminder, all of this is part of that hypnotic regression. And at the end of this regression, this major is going to use a hypnotic suggestion so that they hope anyway, Terry will not remember any of this, that they will have recovered the intel, but Terry won't remember anything, not consciously. And so this major says, quote, "Terry, in just a moment, I'll take these ugly memories away forever. You will forget everything that happened to you at Devil's Den. You will forget that big ship and the aquariums, the men in tan uniforms with orange insignias. You will forget your trip to the moon, the things you saw, and the things you were told about the moon. You will forget everything that happened to you at Devil's Den, and you will forget everything that happened to Toby. Ready?" Unquote. And then he takes Terry through a count up and then has Terry reach up and switch off a light, mentally speaking, so as to close the session. And again, they are hoping that Terry will not remember anything at that point. And just to clarify, you should probably read the book if you want to know all of the details. I do recommend it, Incident at Devil's Den. But in that section there was reference to the moon. As part of Terry's time on board that craft, they actually show him the backside of the moon where he supposedly sees a full city structure, and that there are human beings on the moon as well, and they have been there for decades apparently. That's what he's told by a specific hybrid being. Again, I think this speaks to the fact that these experiences, these encounters are complex. While they can be shocking and discombobulating and ontologically confusing, and while they are painful often, especially during the medical procedures, it's not as simple as saying they are malevolent or nefarious. And Terry goes out of his way to say that. We just read that section. And in addition to all of that, while all of this is happening, all of these strange, bizarre, bewildering, and sometimes painful experiences, remember, even when he comes back from the abduction, both he and Toby are in a lot of pain. Every bone in their body aches, is the way he puts it. But while all of this is going on, Terry actually has a hybrid watcher, this female figure that seems to be part gray alien and part human, who tries to encourage him, tries to show compassion towards him, tries to counsel him through this entire experience. And indeed, it is she who later warns him about what the military may do, not the aliens. And we'll get to that in a moment. But I first want to jump forward to a section later on in the book, much later on, where Terry finds himself waking up, sitting in his family room. And before we jump into that section, again, I just want to remind you that these experiences for many people like Terry happen over a lifetime. And in fact, Terry remembers this female figure, this female hybrid human figure from childhood even. In fact, he realizes only in retrospect that the reason why his actual Asian neighbor, who was a woman that lived next door to them, made him feel uneasy is because she reminded him of this hybrid being, this hybrid female entity who had been his guide ever since childhood. Very interesting. Now, she reappears again after a long period where he'd had no contact with these aliens whatsoever. And this is the section we're going to jump to in the book now, later in the 2000s. Quoting from that section of the book, quote, "When I opened my eyes, I found myself in our family room. I was seated upright in my chair and sweating profusely. I could see the alarm panel from my chair. The alarm was set and had not been triggered. Never in my life have I walked in my sleep, not once. Seated directly across from me is what I first mistook to be a small Asian woman. I would estimate her height at 4 feet. She wore oversized sunglasses that hid her large almond eyes and part of her face. She wore a red headscarf she had loosely tied to hide her pencil-thin neck. Aside from the red scarf, she was dressed all in black. Black blouse, buttoned to the top with long sleeves that partially hid the 4 very long digits. Her pants and shoes were also black. She sat casually with a non-threatening posture. My first thought was the Men in Black, or the MIB, who supposedly confront people who've had UFO experiences. Their alleged goal is to dissuade witnesses from telling others about their experience. Honestly, I thought the MIB stories were urban legend and just a movie plot. But even urban legends sometimes have a kernel of truth. I felt mildly sedated. The house was silent except for my breathing. I caught that strange ionized scent in the air, and the hair on my arm stood up. I thought to call out for my wife, but I knew she wouldn't wake up. They made sure of that too. I recall that in 1987, my wife woke up to find a tiny woman standing at the edge of our bed. She spoke telepathically and told her, quote, "Everything is okay, go back to sleep," unquote. An entity, possibly the same entity, now sitting across from me, may have visited our home in 1987 and never tripped the alarm or disturbed the dog. I guess I shouldn't be surprised to find her in my home a second time, unquote. Now, just to be clear, this is in the 2000s, much later on. And again, she's here to comfort him and to warn him to some degree. Jumping back into that section of the book, quote, "I was certain I met her during that abduction and probably a long time before that. The voice I heard in my head came as plainly as a spoken word. She spoke with perfect English grammar with no discernible accent. She responded to my thoughts immediately. 'Yes, I'm that woman. No, you will not be taken tonight. No more examinations ever. I promise.' Her promise ebbed my fear by a degree. Very soon all my fears had vanished. I wasn't surprised," unquote. So just to set the stage here, remember this is decades later. This is in the 2000s when Terry is actually contemplating writing a book and taking this information public, including the information that was supposedly classified and part of his non-disclosure agreement. Now she's come to warn him about the consequences if he goes ahead with his plan for disclosure. Jumping into that conversation from the book, quote, "What could I know that is so important? Lots of people write books and openly discuss their experiences. Why am I singled out?" She was unequivocal. "You know things and you have seen images of things that are crucial to their shared agenda. They are important to both your government and to my hosts. You are not aware of their importance and you can't discern which memories are sensitive and should not be disclosed. To remove them now would cause you great harm." It was difficult to stay on topic. I asked, "Is this thing in my leg tied to all of this?" By the way, as a quick aside, he found an implant in his leg at one point. Jumping back into the book, quote, "How many people have been tagged with an implant like mine?" I wanted to know, but I wasn't prepared for the answer. "Many, many thousands over 3 generations," was her reply. I was stunned by her answer. I asked her, "Please answer 2 questions for me. What is the purpose of this thing in my leg? Are you here to persuade me to not disclose what I know?" Her answers continued to astonish me. "You have devices in both of your legs. They serve a purpose and they have caused you no harm. If you continue to speak publicly and if you publish your book, my hosts will recover them. That is the limit of my host's concern." Then it occurred to me, my left leg had never been x-rayed. I have 2 of these things inside of me? My next thought was, why? How can the devices be removed? My hosts will not allow you to have them removed here and analyzed by terrestrial scientists for their composition. They won't harm you and you'll experience no pain. They'll remove them from your body while you're sleeping. Your government also has interests in you and in your devices," she added. I asked, "I still don't understand. Can you answer plainly? These things in my leg, what purpose do they serve?" The devices have many purposes. The concern among all is that once disclosed, they will support your claims. Your government will not allow it. They will first attempt to discredit you, she said with emphasis. "Who are your hosts?" I asked. It seemed like such an odd way to refer to whatever entity she worked for. Host can be a verb as in to host a dinner party. It can also be used to reference a symbiotic relationship that can be mutualistic or parasitic. She gave an eloquent reply. "You call them aliens. I refer to them as my hosts because they are not alien to me." With that question answered, I asked again, "A lot of people write books, speak in public and in the media on the topic of extraterrestrial beings visiting Earth. Why would my government not allow me to disclose these things? Why is my information any different?" Unquote. Now at this point, Terry is still somewhat confused. If you noticed earlier, this hybrid being suggested that at first the government would attempt to discredit Terry, but their attempts to stop his move for disclosure would not stop there. In fact, the most poignant moment is when she says to Terry, quote, "Your government will kill you," unquote. And here she's referring to what they will do, the government, if Terry continues with his plan to go public. Now, at this point, I'd like to step back and reflect on everything we've talked about, everything we've read from this book, both in this episode and in the previous one, episode 54. This clearly is yet another case of a human being who's experienced abduction accounts repeatedly over the course of a lifetime. But along with that, we have to remember that there are often long periods of time where nothing apparently happens. Sometimes decades can go by for people like Terry Lovelace when nothing really happens. At least nothing that's conscious, because again, part of the challenge here is that just because you don't remember something happening doesn't mean it hasn't. In fact, often it's only after he's experienced some kind of associative triggering event in his life that suddenly a memory surfaces. Because again, the challenge here is that these others can control our memories. They can take memories away, they can cover over them with screen memories, and they can implant false memories. There's some evidence for that as well. So being able to actually ascertain what has actually happened over the course of a life when you are an abductee or a contactee is very complex. The degree to which they can control our actions, our thinking, our feelings, and our behavior is astounding. Now, speaking of triggering associative kind of events that happen that do end up surfacing memories, in Terry's case, there were some very bizarre ones. For instance, one time he was walking with his wife in the mall, rounded a corner, and saw mannequins in a store window. And that was enough for him to suddenly have memories of gray aliens. That alone suddenly made his heart rate race to the point where he feared that he was actually going to have a heart attack. And this came out of nowhere. Nothing had been happening recently to suggest that anything like this was going to happen. We also mentioned how his Asian neighbor, this female Asian neighbor, was enough to trigger discomfort in him, though he couldn't at the time understand why. In fact, when we can't relate this back to some memory, we assume it must be something about that person themselves. As it turns out, it was nothing about this lady. It turns out this neighbor lady was very friendly and would often bake cookies and whatnot for the neighborhood kids. The reason why she made him uncomfortable as a kid was because she reminded him unconsciously of this hybrid being, this hybrid watcher being that we just discussed. And just to really highlight this aspect of the phenomenon where abductees will suddenly have triggering events that bring back memories that are somewhat traumatic, when Terry went and actually sought counseling at one point and had some brain scans done, it was clear to the therapist, who was very compassionate and empathetic, that Terry was showing all the signs of PTSD. This was actually showing up in the tests they ran on him. And she asked him, again, empathetically, what kind of events had he been through that would bring about the eventuality where he was showing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, she knew from his history that he had not actually been in combat. When he was in the military, he never left the United States. Even when they found the implant in his knee, they wondered if that was shrapnel from warfare. But again, Terry had never been in combat. And to this therapist's credit, she actually believed him. Although he was very hesitant to say much about the abductions at all, she knew there was something he was not saying. And she said to him that whatever he had experienced, it clearly was real enough that it had resulted in a classic case of post-traumatic stress disorder. And in fact, she was ready to refer him to someone else who actually also had had experiences with something like UFOs or aliens, that was a therapist that she thought could help him. Now, as we step back from a case like that of Terry Lovelace and the many people like him who've experienced these kinds of encounters over a lifetime, I think a couple things are clear. Number one, this is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon involving abductions, apparent hybridization programs, memory adjustment, behavior modification, and on it goes. In Terry Lovelace's case, he's mostly made peace with these events, looking back over the course of his lifetime. He doesn't believe they mean him harm or meant him harm at any point in his life. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that the experience was traumatic, was discombobulating, was ontologically shocking. And therefore, even if people ultimately end up seeing these experiences as positive or neutral, I would argue that our response to people, to experiencers, abductees, contactees, should first and foremost be one of patience and compassion. Now, before we sign off for this edition of Point of Convergence, I want to bring to your attention a new project I've undertaken, which is titled Liminal Frames. Liminal Frames will be a podcast of which the episodes will also be published to my YouTube channel at ExoAcademian, where I am joined with my co-host Nathan, also known as A Waif Soul on Twitter, to embark upon a twice a month, 90-minute or so conversational dialogue around issues to do with the UFO phenomenon, high strangeness, and all other aspects of paranormality. I'm very excited about this new venture, and I'm quite confident that if you enjoy Point of Convergence, you're also going to very much enjoy Liminal Frames. And speaking of that, this upcoming Monday, only a couple of days from now, the inaugural edition of Liminal Frames will be published. Again, it will be its own dedicated podcast. So if you're listening on a podcast platform right now, you'll want to find Liminal Frames on your platform of choice. And by the way, heads up, the word frames is spelled with a PH, not an F. PH playing off phenomenon, of course. So Liminal Frames with a PH for frames. And if you're listening on my YouTube channel, you'll be able to find the Liminal Frames episodes right here. Again, I hope you tune in. The first episode's already been recorded, gets released on Monday. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I hope you'll join Nathan and I in an ongoing, engaging, and entertaining discussion around the UFO phenomenon and co-arising anomalous phenomena. That's coming Monday. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.